in this process. So I just wanted to make that clear, and I'll send out an email after this meeting with those details. I also wanted to take a minute to make a few announcements regarding the technology that we're using for this meeting today. Obviously, we'd prefer to be holding an in-person meeting that would allow for a nice face-to-face discussion, but that just isn't the current reality. So what we're asking you all to do is just please remain muted in order to avoid any excess background noise. You can check your user control panel to see if you're muted or not. And we're also asking that please don't use your video camera during the meeting so we can hopefully avoid any bandwidth issues. I'll also note that you can view the presentation in full screen mode if you click the three dots in your user control panel. That's an option if you click in there. And if you are experiencing any IT issues, we're asking that you please, you could type those into the chat box. So that's the icon that looks like a talk bubble. And we've got an IT specialist on hand that can address any of those concerns you might be having. In order to facilitate a discussion on the meeting today, we're going to be pausing at a few different points in the presentation for questions and answers. And what we're asking you to do is to type a question or comment that you want addressed into the chat box. And we'll have a moderator on standby monitoring the chat for questions, and the team will address them at those points where we pause. And if you're on the phone and not using Teams, we will also check at times to see if anybody that's on a phone has a question. At that point, you could unmute yourself and ask your question. And so briefly, why are we here today? So as I mentioned at the beginning, the PSC and CADMIS are kicking off a potential study whose ultimate purpose is to understand energy efficiency potential in the state and to develop sound data and analysis to inform the Public Service Commission as they make decisions for Quad 4 of focus. And just to briefly recap, the 2015 to 2018 Quad period for focus was highly successful. The portfolio showed and continues to show high cost effectiveness, positive economic impacts to the state. The programs offered by Focus have a very strong return on investment and contribute to jobs and productivity statewide. The current Quad is in its second year, and we're beginning the planning process for the next Quad that's set to begin in 2023. The last potential study that informed the Quad 3 planning was extremely valuable in informing the planning process and the portfolio design. And the time is right now to continue to look to the future to understand how to sustain this long successful program. So the potential study is an opportunity to do that, to explore emerging issues in technology and to assess the remaining potential for existing areas. And so this meeting today is one of the first steps in the Quad 4 planning process. And as you can see from the timeline, we're just kicking this process off for Quad 4, and the potential study is one of the first things that's started as part of the process, and it's going to be conducted over the next year and a half or so. The findings from the potential study lead into commission decisions on the scope for Quad 4, and then these decisions provide further direction from the commission that lead to additional research, analysis, stakeholder collaboration. There's a few points along the way where the commission seeks public input, and those are marked on the timeline here. Public input is sought during the scoping process, and as well as once the staff memo is delivered to the commission for decisions and directions for Quad 4. That's scheduled to occur in the spring of 2022, the final commission decisions for the Quad. The potential study is integral in determining appropriate savings goals for the commission and the program administrator. It also informs many of the key policy decisions that the commission has to make. And once the commission's decisions are established, the program administrator can begin program planning and preparation for the start of the new Quad that will begin January 1, 2023. So that's just a high level overview of Quad 4 planning and where the potential study fits in. During Lakin's presentation, he'll dig further into the specific milestones of the potential study timeline in his presentation. So with that, before I hand it over to Cadmus for their presentation, happy to have Commissioner Tyler Huebner on the call today, who I would invite to make some opening remarks. So Commissioner Huebner.
Yeah,
please.
Can you hear me, Mitch?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Super. Well, I just wanted to take a couple minutes and thank everybody, welcome you to the beginning of this process, and thank you all for being here. I know it's a little different being virtual, but we really appreciate your engagement on Focus on Energy and its continued success. I was appointed as a commissioner in about mid-March of this year and serving out a term here until March of next year, and then could possibly, hopefully, get reappointed for another 6-year term after that. Recently, I was delegated as the lead commissioner for Focus on Energy and the Office of Energy Innovation at the Commission. So myself and my executive assistant, Mark Bender, will be engaging with the team and engaging with you all on Focus on Energy throughout this process and as we lead up to the next Quad plan. As Mitch said, as we all know, Focus is a very cost-effective program. It benefits our state in a lot of ways, our economy, our environment, public health, and the customers that take advantage of it as well, and all ratepayers, because it's helping to hold down rates and costs. And as Mitch said, there's a lot of change. We know there's continues to be change in the industry, continues to be new technologies, so it continues to be an exciting time to be part of this process. And just a little background of myself, I've been working on energy efficiency and clean energy now for over a decade, and was working with utilities. I was a consultant at ICF. I know they are a subcontractor and engaged with Focus on Energy. I was out in California at that time, but working with utilities all across the country on energy efficiency plans and with the Energy Star program federally. And then in low-income weatherization, both in the federal government at Department of Energy and here in the state of Wisconsin. And then I was working on renewable energy at Renew Wisconsin for the past about 7 years before I joined the commission. So excited to bring that history and experience on board here to the commission and to this responsibility as delegated commissioner. So with that, want to thank you all again. As you all know, a robust stakeholder input and process is really essential for Focus on Energy to keep pace with the changing times and changing technologies. And myself and the whole team really value your expertise and experience from your different perspectives. And we hold that in high regard. So thanks again for being here and looking forward to the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm going to hand it over to the Cadmus team to handle their part of the presentation. So Lakin, if you're on, take it away.
Thank you, Mitch, and thank you, Commissioner. Mitch, I just wanted to make sure that you and everyone else can hear me okay before I begin.
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, fantastic. Well, hello, everyone. Again, my name is Lakin Garth, and I'm with the Cadmus Group. And on behalf of the Cadmus Group, I just want to express our gratitude for being able to work with Focus on Energy on the upcoming potential study, and to have an opportunity today to engage with a very large and very diverse set of stakeholders. I will admit that I'm a little upset that we're not able to do this in person. and that we could see everyone face to face and eye to eye, but hopefully the current circumstances change and we'll be able to do that during the timeline of this potential study at some point in the future. Nevertheless, the show goes on, and so I just wanted to briefly introduce a few key members of the Cadmus Potential Study Management Team. I believe a number of folks on the line may be familiar with Steve Kofer and Amalia Hicks. Steve is principal investigator for the Focus on Energy evaluation, and Amalia Hicks is the evaluation lead. They'll have a strong role in the potential study as well, providing oversight, making sure that our team has what we need on a daily basis. Also, a couple of other key members of the potential study management team. I want to briefly introduce Aquila Valonis. Aquila will serve as our engineering lead and as our liaison to any primary data collection that does occur during the course of the potential study, and how we integrate that into engineering analysis and the actual characterization of energy efficiency managers. Jeremy Eckstein will serve as the project manager. And so he'll have a big task in front of him to make sure that our communication is effective, both internally and externally, to PSC, to Focus on Energy, and to the many stakeholders that are on the call today. I'll be serving primarily as the modeling lead. That was a similar role that I undertook in the last potential study that for Focus on Energy that occurred in 2016 and completed in 2017. Just a little bit of background about myself. I've been at Cadmus for about 7.5 years. I currently lead with Aquila Valonis, our planning and assessment team, and engaged in energy efficiency planning and potential studies of all shapes and sizes throughout the United States. Prior to joining Cadmus, I worked in the planning department at the Energy Trust of Oregon. So I've got decent familiarity with how Systems Benefits Administrator programs work. And again, just extremely grateful to have this opportunity to do some additional modeling this time around, and to take a role with the management team at Cadmus and to work with the PSC and Focus on Energy at large. Briefly, I wanted to present the agenda for today's meeting. There's a few key items to discuss, as this is the stakeholder kickoff meeting. The first is just to provide an outline of what this meeting and future meetings will contain as it regards stakeholder engagement with the potential study. So today I'll talk a little bit about objectives and then also lay out a proposal for future meetings, the number of them, a sense of the rough timing, and the subject matter that we plan to cover. After we talk a little bit about stakeholder meetings, we'll then move into the potential study objectives, ultimately discuss how that integrates with overall portfolio planning, talk a little bit about the different types of potential estimated, and discuss in some detail the findings from the last potential study that was completed in 2017. After we talk about objectives, we'll spend a little time on methodology. We're not going to do a deep dive today, though I suspect there will be an opportunity to do a much deeper dive in the future. But we do want to talk a little bit about setting expectations around the methods that we plan to use for technical potential, economic potential, and achievable potential, and to make sure that we gather any feedback from the stakeholders that would help improve our process, make it more transparent, or help educate each other as we get this project started. The fourth area that we'll move to will be milestone activities. And these milestone activities more or less correlate to the planned stakeholder meetings we have. So we'll talk a bit about how we segment customers, data that we collect, characterizing measures, the actual modeling itself, and then of course reporting. As Mitch mentioned earlier, Given the nature of this call being a virtual meeting, and I'm looking at the bottom of my screen, I see upwards of 70 people in attendance. We do have some placeholders throughout the presentation where we'll stop and pause and make sure that we take any questions as they come up. And then we also have time tacked on to the end to do a Q&A. So just want to make sure everybody understands the opportunity is here to provide as much feedback as you can. And I think, as Mitch mentioned, the easiest way to do that to get it started is to write questions into the chat box, dialog box, as they come to you, and we have a moderator who'll be following those questions. So with that, we'll move into stakeholder meeting section, and really, I just want to highlight the three primary objectives we have related to stakeholder engagement. Of course, we're all here to solicit feedback. We want to capture as broad and as many stakeholder perspectives as possible, and also to create a foundation for broader conversation. And so we've designed the stakeholder meeting process to allow for gathering feedback on a variety of topics as it pertains to the overall potential study. Those topics may include things like, have you considered this data source? Have you talked to these people? Have you considered these types of measures that you didn't consider last time? And it also provides an opportunity to comment on results and the draft report. And as someone who was involved in the potential study a few years ago, I'll say that one of the biggest benefits of the stakeholder engagement process at that point in time was that we were able to produce a draft report, present results, and then allow for substantial feedback that I think ultimately really improved the quality and outcome of the previous potential study. Second, under capturing stakeholder perspectives, the scope of the Focus on Energy potential study is very broad, much like the many perspectives that stakeholders bring. It's a statewide potential study. It considers both natural gas and electricity, and then all the different customer classes within those fuel types across the entire state, rural areas, urban areas. And so by bringing this group together, we want to be able to capture as many perspectives as we can that will ultimately inform the methods and the data used and help us characterize and present results and findings in a format that provide meaning to various stakeholders. We're also particularly interested in perspectives that can help us either improve or inform estimates of potential or improve data collection. I think we'll talk a little bit more about what we have planned for data collection in a bit, but an example of the stakeholder engagement in the last study that I think helped improve data collection really had a lot to do with some of the information that we captured from field visits and site visits that were ultimately used to inform saturations and penetrations of efficient equipment in various sectors. And so I remember vividly having a meeting around data collection and understanding from various stakeholders what their perspectives were on secondary data that was good enough to use versus the need to go out and collect new information on data sources that hadn't been collected in some period of time. This potential study, we do have the benefit of having completed one study just 3 years prior. In 2016 and 2017, we didn't have that luxury. It had been quite some time since the previous potential study. And so today, and then again in future stakeholder meetings, I think we'll try to really capture these perspectives and have a particular focus on what information is most useful and what information that can be used to inform the potential study may have changed the most or become more necessary since the last time we performed a potential study. And then finally, again, creating a foundation for a broader conversation. one of my favorite parts of this type of work and my job, frankly, is the opportunity to continually learn things. And I hope that we also do a good job on our side of helping others learn things about how a potential study works, how it may inform the planning process. One of the biggest benefits of doing a study like this is that it does collect a lot of data and does serve as a repository for very helpful information, whether it's regarding program planning or just providing additional data sets that might have otherwise not been publicly available that could be used for various other initiatives around the state. Just a few points there at the bottom of slide 9 that I wanted to point out. Again, we will be sharing key information to this broader stakeholder group throughout the potential study. These include things like measure lists, data collection plans, and as I mentioned previously, draft reports. We also will provide specific questions that we may have to help prompt feedback. There are a variety of methods for each of the components of the potential study that can be used, many of which are widely accepted as industry practice or best standards. But we do recognize that the folks who are stakeholders on this call know your state the best, know your customers the best, and know the issues that people in Wisconsin face. And so we want to make sure that we capture that feedback and take a thoughtful and considerate look at how that may change our approach or the data that we collect and use. We also plan to summarize all of our feedback and to provide responses to anything we receive. And then we will also post these presentations and any relevant documents and materials so that information is available and can be easily accessed. I know that our team has been hard at work at setting up a website where this presentation from today will be posted. I want to go ahead and thank the folks at Aptum for helping us get that set up in time. And I understand that we'll be sending a follow-up email after the meeting with more instructions about the information that will be contained on the potential study website. So those are our primary objectives. One more slide under the stakeholder meeting section, and then Mitch and Jeremy, I know you're on the phone. I think after this slide, on slide 10, we'll take a brief pause and see if we have any immediate feedback about the nature of the stakeholder meetings and what folks can expect. So just briefly, slide 10 provides our initial proposal of future stakeholder meetings. Again, we've had some internal discussions. We obviously have developed a work plan that we've worked on internally to help devise when we think it would be useful to engage stakeholders, at what points in time, and the types of material that we can be covered. We don't anticipate that this will be every meeting externally to external stakeholders throughout the study, and that we certainly imagine that some additional meetings may be scheduled as needed. But at least from a starting point, we have the ones that are on slide 10, as a proposal. So again, today we're kicking off, and the idea is primarily to obviously provide an overview of the potential study and to capture any feedback on our approach. A few months from now, we plan to have a stakeholder meeting that centers around primary data collection, including reviewing various data collection options and plans. A few months after that, in the fall, we intend to have a stakeholder meeting that is for those folks who are primarily interested in getting into a lot more details regarding how we characterize measures, the different types of technologies that are included in the study, and also an in-depth dive into the different modeling approaches. And as part of that discussion, we also plan to discuss different scenarios. And so one of the hallmarks of the previous study in 2017 was that we did look at a wide range of scenarios. And so getting feedback from stakeholders on what type of scenarios and what may be most useful from your perspective would be very helpful. And then in spring of 2021, We're planning to show draft results at that point in time. And again, the intent there is to present draft results and then provide the draft report, and then have a period of time to receive written comments that we can then use to either help improve the draft results before we finalize them, and also to provide any additional feedback regarding methods used or data sources or outcomes or interpretation of the results. And then right now we're scheduled to do a final presentation in summer of 2021, and that presentation would include overall results, findings, and conclusions. So Mitch and Jeremy, I'm going to pause there and see if anyone has initial questions on the stakeholder meetings and the objectives.
Hi, Lakin. No questions so far coming through.
All right, great. Okay. Well, seeing no questions, then we'll move on into the potential study objectives. And so again, the primary purpose and primary objective of the Focus on Energy potential study is to quantify the total energy efficiency potential and specific measure and market opportunities available to focus on energy over the study period. And so when we engage in this type of analysis, we really do produce results at a very detailed and granular level that can be informed for a wide range of individual program and portfolio planning. And so the overall intent is that through an open stakeholder process and through a continued dialogue and through a lot of data collection and analysis, that we produce a set of results and interpretation of those results that can then be used to inform the next quad planning process and help set targets and goals during that process, and help set the boundaries for implementation. And so on the left-hand side, you see this sort of classic energy efficiency process diagram, where in the upper right-hand quadrant, we start with the potential study, which is really obviously a forward-looking exercise using the best available data we have to inform our estimates of potential, which then feed into planning and implementation. And then as planning and implementation occurs, there's evaluation that draws out information to help improve programs over time. Some of that is more process oriented, some of it is more research oriented, and some of it is frankly more impact oriented, which then can be used to help feed the cycle again and serve as inputs into the overall potential study in the future. And so really it's cyclical in nature. We started this process for the 2017 potential study in early 2016, which I believe was the second year of that quad, and it took a little over a year to complete the potential study, which is in the third year of that quad, and then the quad 4 planning, the quad 3 planning process took place, and eventually set targets. And so we're on a similar timeline here. We've actually gone ahead and sent out an initial data request to utilities and started working on some of the initial work that takes some time to get the potential study set up. But overall, it's again primarily to produce estimates that can then be used to inform planning for the next quad. In terms of the study horizon, it's a 12-year potential study horizon. So the first year would begin in 2023 and then would end in 2034, with a real focus on the quad 4, which would be 2023 through 2026. And so The study itself will produce a series of achievable potential. We, in the previous study, produced a core scenario that was based on business as usual funding and commission approved inputs. And those inputs included things like discount rate, avoided energy and capacity costs, emissions factors, and things of that nature. So the core scenario in the previous study and what we have planned so far would be to consider, what would be to estimate potential based on what we understand that the current status is with respect to business as usual funding and current commission approved inputs. That being said, we do plan on doing a number of sensitivity analyses. We haven't written these down or submitted these in stone yet, but some examples of what we've considered previously and what we're considering currently include looking at how changing various inputs would affect the overall level of potential. And so, for example, changing discount rates would change the value of the benefits that we receive from energy efficiency. And so that type of scenario would affect economic potential and would affect achievable potential. We also can look at different avoided cost forecasts, either energy or capacity forecasts, and avoided carbon prices. So the primary purpose of doing sensitivity analysis is that we know that we're estimating potential into the future, and there's obviously a lot of uncertainty around what may occur over a 12-year timeline beginning in 2023. And so by looking at different sensitivity analysis, we are able to present a range of possibilities, considering that we don't know everything today that may occur at some point in the future. Another point that I'd like to make about the sensitivity analysis, one other option is to also consider changes to funding levels. And so whereas we plan to look at a core scenario that's built on business as usual funding, there may be interest from stakeholders in looking at a scenario that increases funding levels or changes funding levels to see what additional efficiency may be possible, as a result of looking at additional spending on focus on energy. So again, I want to pause. We've presented briefly the primary objective of the study and talked a little bit about our planning around core scenario analysis and some of the sensitivity analysis possibilities. And so I'm curious to understand if there's any additional perspectives that we should gather from stakeholders, particularly regarding the objectives of the study, any clarification there, or any additional scenario analysis that we should consider.
Hi, Lakin. We have a question from Kathy Kuntz, and she is curious if there is a way to assess carbon regulation. The price of carbon might not fully capture the impact associated with carbon regulations. And she says she thinks about the communities that are setting climate goals, for example. And Kathy, feel free to further clarify if you'd like.
Sure. And Kathy, if you're there and I think you should be able to unmute yourself if you like. I think if I understand the question correctly, in addition to looking at carbon prices, one of the options, or what I understand your question to suggest is that if there were, or if there are either communities or municipalities or counties or at the state level, plans or interventions to address carbon emissions, how would or could the potential study consider and characterize how those efforts may drive additional efficiency? Am I getting that correct? Close.
Like, I'm not sure. Can you hear me? Did I set this up so my speaker works?
Loud and clear.
Okay. I was thinking the other way that you know, when we put a price on carbon in those scenarios, it usually doesn't have as much impact as it seems like it should for whatever reason. And so I was thinking about all of the things happening in Wisconsin right now around, you know, we have a gubernatorial task force again on climate change, that it's feasible that there's some bigger pressure to reduce emissions, and that maybe a price on carbon isn't the only way to put that into the scenario. I'm not sure what I think that other way is, but I sort of would like to see some sensitivity around something a little bit more than the price on carbon, because I'm concerned that that doesn't do as much for the cost effectiveness as maybe it's going to turn out actually happens.
Okay, yeah, I understand, and I think I will take an initial provide an initial answer to your question, and then I'll check with Mitch and others at the PSC to see if they have any additional feedback. But yeah, as you pointed out, the primary effect of looking at scenarios around avoided carbon prices is that it's basically a question of economics, and so that type of scenario would alter the amount of economic potential that the study is estimated relative to a core scenario. We have at least in some initial meetings with the evaluation working group, and then also internally, discuss the possibilities around what we plan to report as from emissions savings from the potential study. But in terms of looking at how any sort of external policy drivers may change the results, we haven't had those discussions yet. But I do want to pause and see if Mitch or anyone from the PSC has any additional information to add that around what we could consider in terms of scenario analysis and carbon policy within the state.
This is Mitch. I just jump in to say that since we are right at the initial stages of the potential study, we'd just be interested in learning more about what those scenarios and the analysis looks like. And I can't really get too much further into it than that right now. I'm getting a lot of feedback on my microphone. So, there's obviously opportunities with what's going on in the state and different local municipalities to use the potential study, the outcomes from the potential study to learn more. What that actually looks like. To me, it's I don't have a good sense of that right now, but that's a very good point to make for a scenario sensitivity analysis. Sorry, if there's anyone else from the PSC that would like to comment on that, I'd be happy to do that.
Mitch, this is Joe Fontaine. Am I coming through okay?
Yeah.
Okay. This might actually be useful to think about this in terms of how we connect this to quad planning. When the commission has considered carbon prices before, the options they've been given are a market-based price, which is what is used right now, and a social cost of carbon, which I think Kathy might at least start capturing more of the broad scope impacts that you're thinking of. So that is something that will be reconsidered in quad planning after this potential study, and it could be very useful to have a conversation as we set up scenarios in the study that can also flow through to that policy conversation after that.
We have a couple of other questions. Is this question sufficiently addressed? Can we move along?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay,
Thanks.
great. The next question is from Scott Blankman, and Scott is curious about how the study will take into account the temporal, that is time value of energy efficiency, as more renewables are added to the system. Aligning consumptions or energy efficiency savings with renewables will be increasingly important. And Scott, please feel free to further clarify if needed.
I think that's a good summary. I think it also touches on Corey's comment that's a little bit later with regards to demand elements of the programs as well, as we see changes in consumption behaviors.
This is Lakin, and thank you for your question, Scott. This is a really good one, and I'll start. I'm trying not to go too deep in the weeds here. I believe in the 2017 potential study, the primary source for the avoided electric and for that matter avoided gas energy forecasts valued those elements on an annual basis. And in the economic screen, we do follow the modified TRC. And so we not only look at the avoided energy costs, but we also look at the avoided capacity costs, at least from avoided generation capacity. And so in the previous study, and I think what the plan is for the current study is that at least at the economic screening level, we don't have currently more discrete forecasts of avoided energy that would allow for the better quantification of the time value of energy efficiency. And I'm going to just look and acknowledge there's 80 people on this phone call. And, you know, this is a fairly technical question in the sense that not every kilowatt hour saved has the same economic value. Some savings are more economically valuable than others, particularly with respect to utility system peaks, which primarily in Wisconsin, I believe, are still summer peaking. And so if we did have an hourly energy forecast, we would need to then couple that information with additional load shape data, pretty much at a measure or to a certain degree at an end use basis, where we could then better quantify annual energy savings at a more discrete level to capture the time value of energy efficiency more discreetly. It's a long answer to a question, Scott. I hope I got that mostly correct. The other thing I will say is that, you know, we do plan to use the Wisconsin TRM as the primary source of energy efficiency measures. And to the degree that it contains coincident peak demand savings, you know, we obviously do plan to report demand savings from energy efficiency. Obviously, we have to quantify those as part of the economic screen, so it's relatively easy to estimate that information. But as of right now, the avoided energy forecast is at an annual level.
Any follow-up on this one? We have a couple more.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Great. Lakin, next one is from Rebecca Upham. Sorry if I mispronounce any names here. And she asks, when looking at energy efficiency savings, are we looking at source or site energy? And she clarifies, source energy would likely be more relevant to carbon considerations and environmental impacts. And she just clarifies that is asking because currently they're reporting site energy savings. And Rebecca, please feel free to clarify as needed.
I think that's it, unless somebody has a question about what I mean by any of that.
This is Lakin, and that is a great question. We do primarily report site level energy savings. It's honestly escaping me if from the last potential study, if we reported savings, if we looked at what those savings were at generation. But I believe the primary measure analysis is at a site level. But the economic avoided energy cost forecast does have to take into account line losses that get you from the customer meter to the generator.
Yeah, and Lakin, this is Joe again. I may be oversimplifying this from a technical perspective, but there is a flat line loss factor that's generally included in the cost effectiveness screen. So that would be a relatively simple thing to play out different scenarios at site and source.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, acknowledging that this is statewide potential study, and that actual line loss factor could vary greatly depending upon geography, utility service area, type of customer, that sort of thing. So that's right. We did include a flat line loss value.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I just also mentioned this because, there's a difference between, gas and electric as far as, how many BTUs it actually takes to create a kilowatt, or a BTU of electric versus, how many BTUs go into a BTU of gas once it, gets to your building. So it's not just line losses that I'm thinking of. And I just was wondering if any of that is thought about or accounted for in any of these studies, since, I think it's kind of what happens at the source. It kind of impacts what our goals are for actually having this program in the first place. But so that was just something I wanted to kind of throw on the table there.
Yeah, so this is Joe again, and let me say this because I think it segues to Corey's question too on demand, is that I think in a modeling context, this can come up as an issue of assessing what our assumptions are up front. That's true for the definition of demand that we're using for demand savings has been something that hasn't been reviewed in a while, and may be true for what we're calling line loss factor now in terms of considering how that captures everything you're talking about, Rebecca, or whether there's other sorts of inputs we want to add. So those all seem to be a good opportunity for modeling discussions a step or two down the time frame that we had outlined before.
Okay, thank you.
And we did have an additional question from Corey Singletary. And I wonder, Corey, if your question on demand has been addressed here, or if you would like to ask any more specific follow-up directly, since we've kind of brushed on it.
Yeah, thanks. It has to a certain extent. I guess my question was more, a related issue is, for example, the overall level of funding, which helps inform sort of statewide policy decision making by the commission and other consumers of the potential study. Similarly, what we experienced a little bit, some of the other stakeholders in the last quad plan, was when we got to this particular decision point, we all had certain thoughts and opinions about demand versus energy as a focus on energy. and how resources are allocated, but there weren't really results presented or prepared in a way that would help inform that decision making. Whether it be at sort of a high level 30,000 foot view level demand versus energy, or more getting to what Scott was talking about in terms of a more granular time varying value of energy and demand reductions. So that was more what I was getting at is that going to be, I guess, you know, a goal to produce some sort of results or something within the potential study that would help inform that specific decision point for the commission.
Yeah, this is Lakin, and thank you for your question, Corey. That's a great question, and I know that this isn't the first instance that a question like this has arisen in the context of a potential study, you know, for an entity that's largely been focused on energy in the past, and now, you know, now sees an increasing need to understand the demand impacts of energy efficiency. And so I'll say this: we do have many measures in the potential study, and we certainly do have the ability to provide a really dynamic view of what the estimated demand impacts from future energy efficiency will be as it relates to the potential study. I think this is the appropriate forum, and I think, you know, future meetings or conversations by phone or by email would be appropriate to kind of get back to a couple of the questions or a couple of the points that Joe raised around how we define demand is really important. Without going in too deep into the weeds, there's varying definitions of demand out there, and so I'm certainly interested in continuing that conversation, because I do think it would improve the potential study, and I do think it would provide a wealth of information that would help inform quad planning. You know, we would want to discuss, for example, how we define it, in data sources that we need in order to estimate demand according to that definition. The pluses and minuses of those data sources. Some are better than others. There's also, you know, much like there's uncertainty around annual energy savings from a measure, there's uncertainty around how the demand is estimated. So deciding on our level of comfort with uncertainty. And then I think also really importantly would be to what you pointed out, you know, in what way could we present results that would be most useful to you and other stakeholders, you know, and not just results, but methods, data sources, that sort of thing. I've got a pretty good idea of how to do it, but I'd prefer, and I think the PSC would prefer, we not operate in a vacuum, and that we do gather that feedback. And so I'll pause there. This subject gets me excited. And so I'll just pause and see if Mitch or Joe or anyone else has something to add.
And this is Mitch. Thanks, Lakin, and thanks for the question, Corey. I will just add that we've expanded the utility data request intentionally to gather more information on system load and use load shapes. So, and they're still in, I know Cadmus is still kind of taking a look at that information to see what it looks like. So that was, you know, intentional, because I think the goal is to make improvements on the data and analysis and research that was done from the last potential study. So definitely appreciate the comment, and then Lakin, your points about not operating in a vacuum is very well made.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. And I'll just add again, I do think it's an important topic. And one of the things that we, as you know, our team as consultants should bring to the table is additional perspectives. And so, you know, if others want to join in on that conversation around demand, you know, we've worked in other jurisdictions, other potential studies, other planning exercises that look at look at a geographical area that's comprised of multiple utilities, and we can provide information regarding how those entities, like in the Northwest, like the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, how they view demand on a regional basis in the context of an energy efficiency potential study. And so it can be fairly nuanced and not for the faint of heart. But I did just want to point that out. We're certainly willing to have that conversation and bring experiences from elsewhere that may inform that process.
Okay, thank you.
And those are the questions we have for now. Are there any additional questions folks would like to ask? There will be several more opportunities to ask questions later on as well.
All right. Seeing or hearing none, this is Lakin again. I really appreciate that conversation was very helpful, and I think got some good information. I just wanted to briefly present some of the findings from the 2017 potential study. Again, we at the time looked at both electric energy efficiency savings, and then on the next slide, I'll show natural gas energy efficiency savings. And we really characterize this on this slide just to provide some context and perspective around what the cumulative business as usual potential look like and the relative share between residential potential and non-residential. And then also looked at 12-year timeline cumulative savings as a percent of the baseline sales forecast for each of the sectors that we considered in the previous potential study. And so this information is just provided as context to show what those results were. You probably would need to have a broader view of what statewide energy consumption looks like to really process the graph on the left, or annual focus on energy goals. But on the right-hand side, I think it puts it in a little bit more context in terms of what savings were as a percent of the baseline forecast. And so on total, the 12-year cumulative savings from the business as usual case on the electric side was a little above 9%. And then we had a similar graph for natural gas. In here, the same way you would interpret the results is that savings as a percent of baseline forecast on a total basis was just shy of 11% there on the right-hand side across all sectors within focus on energy. Right. Just moving along, doing a quick time check. I've got 2 o'clock Central Time, so I think we're making pretty good progress here on slide 17. We're now going to talk a little bit about the potential study methodology. And so the first slide on slide 18 is really a classic slide that explains the different levels or layers of potential that we plan to estimate for the focus on energy efficiency potential study. This chart was taken from a study that was completed in about 2007 by our friends at Optimal Energy on behalf of the United States Department of Energy, which at that point in time was looking at how to establish best practices for energy efficiency potential studies, and really sort of gathered information from studies that had been occurring in the previous 20 to 25 years across the U.S. that considered energy efficiency as a resource and how it was defined. And so, just starting from the top and then moving on down, this potential study will really consider 3 different levels of potential. And the first is technical potential. And really, technical potential is intended to represent a theoretical maximum amount of energy that can be displaced by efficiency over a given period of time And there's one caveat when we say theoretical maximum, and that caveat is that most potential studies, including the one that the method we plan to use for focus on energy, only consider what technologies are known, established, and commercially available as of the start of the study period. And so when we say theoretical maximum, it should also be contingent on the fact that we're only considering things that we know are commercially available. And so we do not intend to predict or derive non-existing technologies that may provide energy efficiency savings at some point into the future. You may have heard this term in other jurisdictions or other places called frozen efficiency. And again, the idea is that in planning, in doing a potential study to either inform near-term program plans or long-term resource plans, that the starting point really only considers what's commercially available. And so from there, dropping down a level, we then consider economic potential. And the primary difference between economic and technical potential is that at this level, to each measure in the study, we plan to apply an economic screen using the modified TRC benefit cost test that's approved for use in Wisconsin that compares energy efficiency as a resource to supply side alternatives. So taking into account the annual energy savings over a measure's lifetime, considering the benefits, the energy and approved non-energy benefits of that measure, we can then estimate economic potential. And so it's typically a subset of technical potential and will be considered sort of one level down. But at this point, once we've estimated economic potential, we've really not considered any additional perspectives, including barriers to adoption on behalf of customers. And that's really the intent behind estimating the third level there, achievable potential, is that for whatever reason, some customers may not wish to adopt energy efficiency. They may not, it may not matter to them, or they may not necessarily have financial means to do so. But nevertheless, achievable potential is intended to represent the amount of economic potential that we can expect would be adopted by customers once we account for barriers and other non-measured costs of delivering programs. And so again, achievable potential, kind of stepping down the ladder there, would be a subset of economic potential, and then would be a subset of technical potential as well. Just one important caveat about the potential study is that we do not, neither CADMAS nor the PSC plans to estimate, specific program potential, nor do we expect the results of the potential study explicitly dictate what future quad goals will be. Both the economic and achievable potential outputs are intended to serve as a resource into the quad planning process. And so it's not, believe it or not, in some jurisdictions, these potential studies do actually have a bit more of a strict constructionist view where folks come in and perform a study and the results are intended to set targets themselves without broader stakeholder perspective or a comprehensive planning process like the one that's in place in Wisconsin. And so that's a really important feature of the study and the quad planning process overall. So moving on, I think in a future stakeholder meeting, we can get into some more of the technical nuances around technical potential and economic potential. But for today, I did want to spend a little bit of time on achievable potential. Last time in the 2017 potential study, the business as usual achievable potential served as the primary reporting metric, both in the report that we produced and as an input into the quad planning process. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the methods that we've proposed to estimate achievable potential. I'll back up one step and say that I think it was in January at an evaluation working group meeting, Cadmus and some members of our team did present to the EWG at that point in time various practices and options for estimating achievable potential within potential studies. And at that point, and again, currently we plan to follow the approach that we used in the 2017 potential study, which is to develop a range of achievable potential scenarios, and to look at both maximum adoption scenarios and less than maximum adoption scenarios based on survey research. And typically, the way that the surveys are designed is that we would walk a customer or utility customer through a series of questions about their willingness to pay or willingness to participate in energy efficiency programs for some specific technologies. And so in 2017, I believe that this slide 19, shows a range of some of those examples of some of those measures, measure categories. These were for the residential sector. I believe we also did this for the commercial sector and industrial and agricultural as well. And the basic idea is that we ask a customer their familiarity with the technology and whether or not they would adopt a measure based on focus on energy or some other entity providing an economic incentive that would cover a portion of that measure's incremental cost. And by walking them through several different options, we then come up with a range of scenarios, and the cumulative affirmative responses to those questions establish, a maximum adoption rate, and that maximum adoption rate is really intended to represent the percent of long-run economic potential that we believe would be achievable. And so the responses vary based on technology, based on incremental cost, based on customer, and based on their customer class. And so this graph just does show those responses, and that it's not always linear and moving from one incentive level to the next. And we also look at a range of scenarios, and then I believe in the previous study, one scenario sort of served as the primary scenario for the business as usual potential. So really, again, this method it ultimately establishes what the maximum long run, which in this case would be 12-year percent of economic potential that we consider to be achievable. And so, in the LED lighting example, if we estimated 100 megawatts of economic potential, then that gray bar is at about 97 or 98. And we would say, okay, of those 100 megawatts that are economic, 97 or 98 would be considered achievable. And of course, it's a 12-year study, and so we need to produce estimates on an annual basis, not just cumulative at the end of the study. And so in order to deploy the energy efficiency resources along a timeline, we also considered ramp rates, which we developed based on historical achievement data. And so some measures have relatively faster rates of adoption than others. And then we also have to match ramp rates to different measure types, because some measures, like retrofit measures, are available at the beginning of a study and could theoretically be acquired at any point in time, while other measures, often referred to as lost opportunity measures, are tied to specific assumptions about measure burnout or new construction. And so the rate at which they can be adopted is slightly different and is actually somewhat bound by time. And so again, this slide just depicts a range of different ramp rates that were selected and applied to different measures in order to estimate their annual achievable potential throughout the 12-year study timeline. So that's a little bit about achievable potential. Moving from there, want to talk just for a moment about some additional changes that we foresee within the context of the current potential study relative to the one in 2017. And one other change that we know is occurring are changes in the avoided cost forecast that we'll be using. And so this slide on the right hand just shows a graphical depiction of the change between 2015 and 2019 commission approved avoided energy costs for natural gas. And so you can see that there's an obvious decline in natural gas avoided costs between the two vintages. And there's also a decline, though we don't have a graph here, in the avoided electric energy forecast. And so overall, the value of both avoided energy cost forecasts have declined, in some instances up to 30%. But those aren't the only avoided costs that are included in the energy efficiency potential study. The other one, of course, is electric generation capacity. And so whereas that forecast of electric generation capacity has also changed, declined slightly, at least in the initial years, it also is forecast to increase over time, whereas in the previous study it was a flat value going into the future. And so again, all things remaining equal, we would expect this to affect economic potential to a certain extent, but it of course depends upon a measure's relative capacity contribution. And so the bottom of the slide there just shows the cost effectiveness, the primary cost effectiveness screen, which is the modified total resource cost test, and provides its definition. One other thing to mention about avoided costs is that in earlier this year, in 2020, we took all the measure analysis from the 2017 potential study and substituted the avoided energy costs from 2019 into the models that we had used to estimate potential in 2016 and 2017 to see what the relative effects of the avoided energy cost forecast would be on potential in that study. And so this slide shows the results of that sensitivity that we ran earlier this year. And I think the biggest takeaways are that in the short and long run, that natural gas is more affected on a percent basis due to the changes in avoided costs, and electric is less affected in terms of the reduction in economic potential due to changes in avoided costs. And I think that largely follows what we would expect, because the electric economic potential depends on both the avoided energy cost forecast and the avoided generation capacity forecast. So for measures that have a higher relative capacity contribution, they'd still be receiving the present value of those avoided generation benefits, which is relatively high. So ultimately, again, just a scenario that we ran earlier this year to see how changes in current avoided costs would have affected the results of the previous potential study. And this just shows those percent declines in potential for 4-year time frame, 12-year time frame for achievable and economic potential. So that brings us to the conclusion of the brief section on methodology. I'm going to pause, have a sip of water, and then see if we have any questions regarding previous study results or previous potential study methods or currently proposed potential study methods.
Hi, Lakin. Two questions from Kathy Kuntz. And the first one's related to achievable potential. And the question is it based on a customer's ability to predict the future? And then the follow-on is to explain why other methodologies for achievable potential are not being pursued for this study. And then I'm just going to, maybe I'll let you address the first one, and then we'll get to our second question.
Can I suggest that the second one is a lot easier? The second one is, the first one is the one you thought I would have, but the second one is when you talk about the economic potential and what's commercially available. I wanted to clarify if that means commercially available in Wisconsin or commercially available, period. And I'm thinking particularly about heat pumps, which are not particularly commercially available in Wisconsin because we aren't actively encouraging them to be, but they are available in other northern climates.
Hey, Kathy, that's a great question, and I'll clarify and say that typically the intent is for measures that are or technologies that are currently available, period. And with respect to heat pumps that fit a certain climate spec, I would suspect that we would certainly entertain and plan to include those measures in the potential study. I think where the line gets drawn sometimes is that we don't want to make any assumptions about fictional technologies that don't exist anywhere. That I think most folks hope and believe there will probably be some new technologies, in the future. Maybe not necessarily within a 12-year timeline, but the intent is to really avoid making up measures or representative measures that don't exist at all.
Sure, that makes sense. Okay, so then of course I want to talk about the achievable piece of this, and I guess I think you did a really good job of talking about all of that, including this avoided cost challenge that we're at this moment where you're going to do the study at a moment that for a variety of reasons, including really good news around renewable energy prices, that costs of both natural gas and electricity have dropped. And so I think that in this moment when we're thinking in Wisconsin about how we get to a clean energy future, this study is a really important one to indicate to us how important energy efficiency will be or not be on that path. Because if the potential study tells us that there's really not very much we can accomplish and it's much easier to put up panels, I think that could, and electrify, I mean, that could lead to a different future than saying there's a lot here. And that's kind of the grounding under my concern that putting an emphasis on achievable potential where, and heat pumps are a good example here, where you're going to ask people about a technology that they've zero exposure to, and you're going to ask them to predict their behavior. None of us could have predicted how fast we adopted smartphones. And I get that this is, you ask a bunch of people and it gives you a projection. I'm just not convinced that it's worth the effort. And the example I know I've talked to you guys about before is the example of high efficiency furnaces. There was a point in the 90s when 80% of the furnaces sold in Wisconsin were high efficiency, and only about 30% of the furnaces sold in Minnesota were high efficiency. Someone doing a potential study and asking people about their likelihood to buy a high efficiency furnace in Minnesota very likely did a potential study where they said the potential is 40% market share. And it wasn't 40% market share. I mean, there are better answers I think we can get by looking at what is happening in other jurisdictions. I appreciate the work that I thought we talked about in Minnesota, where they mostly said if it's economic, that's the maximum achievable. We don't need to spend a lot of time asking people to predict what they're going to do in 8.5 years. So I just want to kind of understand better how we got back to we're going to ask people to predict the future.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. And I do want to acknowledge, the limitations that exist for estimating achievable potential, including this methodology. There are several others out there, and I'm certainly happy to go into as much or as little detail about those as is necessary for folks today. I understand, one of the issues about using a willingness to pay survey to estimate the maximum long run adoption of, for achievable potential as a percent of economic potential, is based on feedback from customers who may not have exposure to these technologies and may not be completely aware of them. And it does require them to provide an answer to a hypothetical situation that hasn't yet occurred. And so that certainly introduces some level of uncertainty. It could potentially bias the answer in a downward direction, like the example that you gave. Or if the sample of customers we talked to were all living on the sunny side of the street, it could potentially bias the answer in the opposite direction. When we did speak last, I believe that we did agree to do some additional research to look at and do some benchmarking around additional options, including looking at data sources that would provide a better sense of what measure adoption is in the long run across different jurisdictions, not just in Wisconsin but elsewhere. I think our team would be supportive of that. I don't see why we couldn't do that research and use it to help inform the potential. In terms of what ultimately serves as the basis for reporting results and informing quad planning. In the previous study, we did rely on business as usual achievable potential, which used this method. And so I think we proposed it this time around to provide as a basis of comparison. But, I'd have to defer to the PSC and to other stakeholders to decide if that's the most appropriate option at this point in time. I don't think, as someone else once famously said, I don't think I'm the decider. I do think it's a discussion that can be had, and I do think that additional perspectives are warranted. And we could reprise the discussion we had at the EWG in January, where we walked through a couple of other scenarios in terms of how to estimate achievable potential, including much simpler ones, which the primary downside is that it's not based on research per se, like what's typically done in the Pacific Northwest. But it is a lot more affordable to just pick a number and say, we think it's going to be this. But the thing that I do like about that is preferred about a willingness to pay approach is that it does use information from people who live in Wisconsin. So it is informed by local opinion and by local ratepayers. Again, acknowledging that predicting the future, your behavior in the future is a challenge. So I'll leave it at that. I'm not sure if Mitch or anyone from the PSC or any other folks on the phone call have opinions. I think this is a good discussion point.
Hey, this is Mitch. I would love to know kind of what the options are out there, what other jurisdictions are doing, and kind of weigh that research against what's initially being proposed here. I think it's an open discussion.
This is Charles Bicknell. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I just want to make the point that although the questions raised on approach are hugely valid and always worth visiting, when you're in a program that's constrained with funding, there's a limited difference that's going to be achieved just from changing the potential through the approach. And what you got to also consider is the huge benefit of finding changes from the available potential for different measures, different types of programs, using a consistent approach. So if using a consistent approach shows that all of a sudden there's a dramatic increase in the potential for heat pumps, right now that's a hugely informative finding for influencing program design and for focus. And so you got to weigh the benefits of switching approach versus that consistency, understanding exactly what you raised about the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches.
I'd love to pursue that more with you. I think we could do that offline. Thanks for responding to this.
And Lakin, we still had another question here from Rebecca Upham, and it was about the interactive effects in the potential model, such as interactions between lighting technologies and how they might affect the total potential of the two, and also interactions across fuels, such as the effect of lighting on gas heating. And Rebecca, please feel free to jump in and clarify if needed.
Sure, I'll probably stay relatively high level on this one, but yes, the methods prescribed in the potential study do account for interactive effects of measures. There's actually multiple layers of interactive effects, including within end uses, and then across fuel types, and also over time. And so things like heating penalties for improved lighting, those are considered interactions between measures that save energy from the same end use are considered, and in the economic screening, a measure that saves both electricity and natural gas, or increases the consumption of one vis-a-vis the other, is also considered. So in short, yes, a lot of interactive effects, they are all considered, and we can certainly in the methodology and measure characterization stakeholder meeting get into a lot more detail. And for additional reference, I think the last potential study report had a pretty good section on it as well.
Thank you.
No problem. Jeremy, any other questions?
That's it.
All right, I feel like that was another great section and another great discussion. I'm looking at the clock and feeling a little bit of pressure here. It's 2:30 Central. We need to wrap up on time. So we've got about an hour left and about 12 slides. This section is related to milestone activities. I'll do my best to move us through these relatively rapidly. and then we'll stop when we have opportunities to ask questions. But I want to make sure I leave enough time for Q&A at the end. I feel like so far the discussions we've had at the pauses have been awesome and fantastic, and so I'm grateful for the opportunity to have those. But I am going to speed it up just a little bit through this section. We've already talked about the different stakeholder meeting proposals. And so generally speaking, the timeline for the stakeholder meetings also follows the timeline for milestone activities. We've actually started customer data segmentation. We've sent out an initial data request to utilities and gotten some of that information back. Very grateful for their participation and willingness to provide us with data. So that's underway. It's required for both the study and to help inform primary data collection, which at least currently is scheduled from the spring through the fall. And then measure characterization lags the primary data collection just a little bit. We get started, and then as we collect data that informs measure characterization, we have to incorporate it. And then we'll start setting up and actually coming up with initial estimates of potential in later this year in the winter and spring of 2021, and then do some reporting in spring of 2021 where we'll present draft results and also produce a draft report. Customer data segmentation. This is near and dear to my heart, and this is an important slide because what it ultimately does is lay out the groundwork for how we estimate potential for varying classes of customers and ultimately how we report that potential. And so if someone has a specific interest or need, it may be low-income customers, for example. It's good to ask questions later regarding how we plan to incorporate data related to that customer segment. As I mentioned, we've already received data from a number of utilities. Thank you again for providing that. Very grateful for it and for the timeliness of it. That includes estimates of, or includes historical and recent sales and customer counts across different sectors and segments. And because it is a potential study that looks forward, it also includes a forecast of sales and customer counts. And in this potential study, where we're looking at statewide potential across multiple utilities, actually pulling together that sales and customer forecast is a bit tricky. And so that will be something that we discuss and present at a future stakeholder meeting to make sure everyone understands how we've developed it and to see if there's any additional feedback we should consider. We also got data, non-residential customer database populations. That helps us understand and develop sample frames for data collection, as well as segmentation for the potential study, residential customer extracts so that we can survey folks if we need to. And then I believe, as Mitch mentioned earlier, we also requested data from utilities regarding system load shapes and peak demand definitions so that we can better understand demand impacts, however we ultimately decide to define demand for the purposes of the statewide potential study. The actual segmentation, the two primary goals are to determine in a base year and for a future forecast period the number of customers and their relative loads or sales by fuel type. And we do this at both a sector, so think about residential or single family, multifamily, commercial, government, industrial, agriculture, and then segment levels. So within commercial, for example, we look at office, retail, grocery, lodging, etc. And it's really essential that we segment properly for baseline forecasts. And those relative distributions of customers segments tend to remain relatively static over time. It would only have major changes if a particular utility forecasts a change or shift from one customer class to another. We also develop sample frames. So we do the segmentation for sample frame construction. If we are able to do site visits or surveys of customers, then we need to have the ability to categorize them together in order to meet certain quotas, to achieve levels of precision within a certain confidence interval. And so there's a lot of detailed work that goes into developing the sample frames. These data sets include contact information. Sometimes there are customers we can't contact. We have to make sure we don't do that. So that's a lot of the work that's happening currently. Because we do also request the non-residential full database, we do get consumption data associated with those accounts. And so we can ultimately develop sample frames that segment based on different usage groups. And so if we need to visit a certain number of high users or low users, we have that ability as well. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about sample frame construction today. We do have a future stakeholder meeting around data collection. That would be a more appropriate point in time to do that. So if that's something you're interested in, stay tuned. After we do the customer data segmentation, there is a very robust and detailed measure characterization task. Any potential study is going to have hundreds of individual measures and probably thousands of permutations if we consider different sectors, different customer segments, vintages. So we do look at both existing construction and new construction and a range of end uses. And so considering all those different permutations, we have to look at obviously the energy savings, but also incremental costs, interactions, someone has mentioned already, measure lives, measure applicability, that sort of thing. One thing I will say about potential study measure characterization is that our approach and most approaches out there tend to take a pretty comprehensive view of the world. And so there may be measures that we characterize that aren't currently offered by programs. And there may be measures that we characterize that are more emerging. The cold climate heat pumps may be an example. There may be measures that are more behavioral in nature and less technology based. And so as we continue throughout the potential study, continue to engage stakeholders, this is an area where I feel like we got extremely valuable information and feedback in the previous potential study, and we're really hopeful to have that level of engagement this time. The review that people provided of the measure list, the considerations and options that were recommended, and areas where people pointed out, gave us feedback, either constructive feedback or pointed out shortcomings in our characterization last time. We were able to incorporate all that information early on and to make sure that we came up with the best possible measure characterization for focus on energy. And so it's something that we obviously take really, really seriously and serves as the backbone of the study. And your feedback and input on this subject is greatly appreciated. Again, I'm moving through these relatively quickly. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A. I'm on slide 28, and this slide is related to data collection. I'm going to slow down just a bit here and remind folks that in the 2017 potential study, we collected an awful lot of primary data collection. We did a lot of commercial premise site visits and surveys. And ultimately, that data is a really, really great repository of information, not only for the potential study, but also for additional planning exercises that programs may need. We also did residential surveys that we supplemented with the existing site visit data, so we didn't have to go into a bunch of homes last time. We were able to rely on data that had been recently collected just prior to the initiation of that study. And we also did a number of expert interviews with with people who have been involved in industrial energy efficiency in Wisconsin. And some of those interviews were with people that had decades of experience and provided extremely useful information. A few months back, our team met internally to start discussing, what type of data collection, primary data collection, we really wanted to engage in, and we set up some guidelines to help us prioritize information that we thought would be most effective and most useful in the potential study. And it was really characterized around areas where we know or think there's ample potential, and areas where we know and think there have been market shifts over the course of the last 3 years or 4 years, and then areas where we feel like we could have strengthened data that we collected last time. Maybe there were segments that we didn't get to. All that said, right now we've really got to balance our priorities, because with what's changed in the course of the last couple of months with COVID-19, we quite frankly don't know what it's possible for us to do within the study timeline. We certainly hoped to get out and collect a lot of information, for example, related to changes that may have occurred in the commercial lighting market. And quite frankly, that idea that may not happen within our study timeline, depending upon a zillion variables that are ultimately beyond most of our control. And so at this point, we're hoping to engage with the stakeholders and let you know that any site visit and survey data collection obviously hasn't started in earnest. We're seeking guidance and information around what folks may think is appropriate, and we have a lot to consider over the course of the near future about what's appropriate, what we think we can collect that is reliable, and then obviously we're going to have to come up with some strategies if some of the data collection methods are unavailable. It's reality. Again, just a couple of months ago, this wasn't even considered a possibility. But as we got closer to today, it's something that we obviously have to take into great consideration. Moving on, just doing a time check. We got quarter till. I think if I keep moving on, we should have plenty of time for Q&A. As I mentioned, some of the data collection considerations that we've considered, at least internally, in our conversation, had to do with the relative levels of savings that have occurred in the past, and a lot of that has been from non-residential programs, and so we really thought about what end uses have driven those savings, and where we felt like additional data collection would improve estimates of future potential. And with respect to the residential sector, we thought about where savings have occurred, where they're likely to not occur in the near future, and where things may change. And some of the considerations that other folks have given us regarding demand estimates, should we consider focusing on collecting data that is more geared around helping us understand HVAC and other mechanical equipment within the residential sector. And so we've really primarily thought about focusing on sector and end uses with the highest energy savings possibilities, and then to try to minimize our efforts on end uses where we think savings will likely either be much lower or phased out or impacted by future code changes, such as residential lighting. So up until this point, these have just been really internal conversations and considerations that we've had, but wanted to mention these to you today in light of what's happening with COVID-19 and with regard to the stakeholder knowledge and awareness of efficiency programs and what's offered out there, and where you think markets may going. So we're obviously looking for a lot of feedback around what's important with respect to data collection. Just a few more slides left. I've got 3 by my count, and then we've got some time for Q&A. Just wanted to briefly describe our potential modeling methodology. Again, we do have a stakeholder meeting that is wholly designed around measure characterization and methodology. But I find this graphic useful in sort of laying out the process at a relatively high level from start to finish. Of course, in reality, a lot of these things happen at the same time, but from a diagrammatic standpoint, it looks nice, and it should indicate that there's a relatively seamless process from start to finish. But invariably, there's always things that come up with data collection and measure characterization that we have to adjust on the fly. But we do employ a hybrid bottom-up, top-down methodology, where for residential and commercial customers, it's primarily bottom-up, and for industrial customers, agricultural customers, it's primarily top-down. But everything really begins with utility sales and customer forecasts by sector, and then of course we have to take those individual forecasts and aggregate them to represent all the focus on energy. And that's actually a bit more challenging than it seems, in the sense that not every forecast is built the same. Not every forecast has the same starting and end date. And so really that's a subject we'll come back to with the stakeholder group. But in general, I believe the last report in 2017 did a pretty good job of characterizing how the starting point, which is a forecast of future sales. We do disaggregate that load forecast, and we disaggregate it with both existing primary data and new primary data and secondary data. And so we disaggregate that utility sales forecast into different market segments and consumption by end use. And so our primary model is an end use efficiency model. And so ultimately we have to derive baseline end use consumption by sector and market segment. And so, for example, if we peel back the layer of the onion and we look at residential single family, we would characterize the total energy used within that segment by the various end uses. So it's pretty detailed. And once we have established a baseline forecast, we then can apply energy efficiency technologies. And we look at first estimating technical potential. And so again, if we go back to our definition, that's a theoretical maximum. We're not constrained by any sort of costs or our market barriers when we estimate technical potential. So we're primarily just interested in the characteristics of those measures that we include and the market stay effect. So we look at savings fractions, fuel share, saturations, the feasibility of measures that can intervene, and then interactions between those measures. Once we estimate technical potential, we then can look at applying avoided energy costs and avoided generation capacity costs to come up with economic potential using the modified TRC cost effectiveness screen. And that provides us with economic potential. And then finally, to get to achievable potential, we have to consider the barriers to adoption, including participant benefits and their perceptions of those and costs, as well as other market barriers, things like familiarity with new technologies and the ability of the construction trades to support a new program or to support specific measure categories. So this is kind of a 30,000 foot level. There's a lot of detail that goes into each of these blue boxes. but just sort of wanted to provide a high level view today. I think the main things to take away is that it is an energy-based model that develops a baseline end use forecast, and so the good thing about that is that we're moored to at least one view of reality going out into the future. We're estimating potential relative to a baseline forecast that doesn't assume any future energy efficiency. So the savings potential that we estimate is all new, what would be installed in the first year of the study and throughout. And so that's the feature of the primary methodology that we employ. The next slide just sort of disaggregates some of this information for us a little bit, and provides a view of what we mean when we talk about sectors and segments, end uses, and then different types of measure treatments. And so we've listed the 6 sectors there, and then within the segments, we've provided some examples of the different segments within each of the broader sectors. And I think the biggest takeaway here is that the potential study produces a lot of outputs, a lot of results, but there's also a lot of inputs that go in that we summarize and ultimately provide to the PSC and to other interested parties that could be really helpful and useful in program planning. And so if you've got a particular focus on, for example, low-income customers, we have data and estimates around the number of those customers and information regarding their energy consumption. And ultimately, we produce potential at that level. So you would be able to see what measures may fit a low-income program or may be most cost-effective for low-income, both electric and gas and over time. So ultimately, we produce these sort of high-level values that you see in a report, but behind the scenes is a very rich and detailed data set. And it's at this point, before we really get into the modeling, where if stakeholders have a particular need or a particular interest in a given segment or end use or class of customers that we can have discussions about inclusion. What we did last time is not set in stone. I will say that in my experience, it was very detailed and very comprehensive, but everyone has a unique perspective and a different niche that they're interested in. And so long as there's reasonably available data sets to help inform segmentation, then we'll certainly consider whatever's out there that would help improve the quality of the study. I mentioned end uses already. We provide a few examples here, as well as examples of the measure types that we apply to end uses. Catching up here, this is sort of the last slide in the methodology section before we get to open floor for questions. And it has to do with reporting. Of course, we do produce draft and final reports that are ultimately provided to stakeholders. We're proposing that sometime in the spring of 2021, hopefully, the world has changed a bit and we can do it in person, but that we have an early results presentation where we walk through what the results of the study are and the initial findings, and then shortly thereafter circulate a draft of the report to stakeholders and have an open comment period where people can review and provide comments before we complete final estimates and produce final results, which we'll present next summer. And so last time in 2017, we got a lot of great comments, a lot of great feedback I don't remember the number, but it was a lot of comments that folks had submitted in writing. And we took a lot of care and a lot of time to make sure we addressed each of those on an individual basis. And some of those comments, ultimately either caught minor errors or gave us a different perspective that we haven't thought of previously. And so we changed how we presented results in a particular section. And ultimately, I think really helped improve the quality of the report overall. So just want to encourage, again, I guess thank everyone for that feedback last time, and just mention that I hope we get the same level of involvement this time. Quite frankly, I've been working on these types of studies for about 13 years, and that's been the best example of stakeholder involvement and comment writing and the way that it informs the results that I've been a part of. And it was really rewarding for our team, and I think ultimately produced a great report for Focus on Energy. We also do provide very, very detailed results at a really granular level within appendix documents. I know not everyone reads every appendix, but those do contain very rich data sets that can be very highly useful for program planning or for any and all types of analysis related to energy efficiency potential, particularly at a very detailed level, measure and use in particular segments. So I'm about out of breath. I wanted to make sure that we caught up on that section and then had time for questions. Jeremy, I've only been hearing my voice for about 20 minutes. I'm sure everyone else is tired of it. So please let me know if we do have some questions.
We have 2 questions so far. And the first question is from Mark Jorley, and it's about industrial segmentation, and specifically how industrial customers who engage in self-generation are treated. And Mark, please feel free to clarify further.
Yeah, to be specific, I'm with Ultra Motion. We operate 4 pulp and paper mills in Wisconsin. We probably on a daily average generate 40 megawatts of electricity that's used internally and then purchase the rest of our energy. So I saw on your slide 26 your segmentation of starting with the utility in terms of what they bill for, and then what the consumers actually purchase. And our information basically slips through the cracks because we're not treated as a utility, nor are we purchasing the full amount of electrical power that we need for our operations. So how might you accommodate that in your model?
Hey, Mark, this is Lakin. That's a great question. And I think I'd agree with your initial assessment in that, we do ultimately start with utility sales forecast, and at least in my limited awareness and knowledge, don't include potential, we don't include, potential energy efficiency potential from energy that's been self-generated. This is the point at which I have to admit a little bit of ignorance, and probably would have to defer to Mitch or one of my colleagues at Cadmus to tell me if we need to consider energy from self-generating resources, and whether or not that's appropriate from a scope level in terms of how our results inform quad planning targets, and whether or not self-generation is included.
Hey, this is Mitch. I will also admit to some ignorance on this topic as well. My initial thought here is that the overall purpose of the study is to inform the focus program planning, which is funded by utility ratepayers, and so that's the main source of the energy efficiency potential. I think that we look at it from a real high level. but then the self-generation piece of it, I'm a little bit unfamiliar with how that interacts with utilities, if all of it is self-generated, or how it even could be captured. So I have to defer to that question as well.
I'm okay. Is it okay to move on to the next one? Sounds like we're at a stopping point with this one.
Yeah, I think if you guys want, you can contact me and we can talk through it further offline.
Yeah, this is Lakin, and I appreciate your question, Mark, and I hate to profess ignorance in front of this many people, but I think that is one we're going to have to talk about and get back to you on. But thanks for the question. You stumped me today. That was a good one.
Thank you for your response. I appreciate it.
No problem.
We have another question from John Nickel, and it's about if we have compared the percent savings from different sectors that were predicted in the 2017 potential study to actual program achievements. And John, please jump in if needed.
This is that's a great question. This is Lakin, and I'm trying to think about the best way to frame that analysis if we could pull it off. I guess the primary issue is that the 2017 study started in the first year of the 2017 study was 2019, and so at least immediately we'd only have 1 year of data unless we sort of backcasted, looked at how our estimates in the last potential study did relative to historical savings, which is okay in most instances. The biggest issue we would run into there is that with respect to potential studies that look forward, they should account for future, explicitly account for planned and known future energy standards. But invariably, since it's estimating new potential, it also accounts for past codes and standards, because whatever saturation or penetration there is of efficient measures, like those aren't necessarily eligible for new potential. So long-winded answer. I should have just said, looking back may be problematic. If we compare the potential study in 2017 to what's been achieved, we've only got 1 year of data, which could be useful. It could be interesting. I don't know to what extent 2019 would be representative of what may occur, over the course of the next 3 years or longer. But I don't know, John, did I mangle that completely?
Yeah, can you hear me?
There's a little bit of an echo, but I think we can hear
me
you
now.
okay.
Sorry about that.
Yes, it's better.
Okay, great. Yeah, again, I guess my point being there is that we might have some data to look at, right, in terms of, and particularly on the industrial sector, which I think is one of the more challenging, well, they're all challenging to predict, but the industrial sector with the process energy consumption and the opportunities there, I think can be a big challenge for a potential study to really dig into. I think it's again, more complex maybe than some of the other technologies. So that's just my point there is that I think if you could maybe inform yourselves by looking back on what percentage of savings that the program is actually getting from different sectors to really gauge, are you appropriately accounting for that for the future?
Got it. I should have just started asking
Yeah,
you.
and I would,
Oh, go
like,
ahead.
and this is Steve Coper with Cadmus. I'll just note that we are just wrapping up the 2019 evaluation, and those findings will be available later this month. So we're really just able to start to do any kind of post-mortem kind of analysis starting kind of in the coming weeks.
Yeah, okay. The other, besides that point, I did want to follow up on the point the last caller was making, which was on the industrial self-generation. And just, I think something to make note of is, as we've worked with industrial customers, typically when they save energy at a site, it's going to be the energy that they're buying off the grid that's going to be reduced, as opposed to their self-generated production. So what I think might be good, and I don't know how the impact here, but if there was any way to include self-generated energy, because that would go into your how much energy, let's say, does an industrial facility or sector use, should include that, because if you're multiplying by percentages of savings or whatever that you're predicting, that overall energy production / consumption is important, I guess. That makes sense?
It does, yeah. I'm trying not to let my mind wander too far, and the best way to resolve that issue. I think it makes sense. I'm going to say we're going to need to look into it, and in particular, data availability, that sort of thing. But yeah, John, that does make sense, and I think that is something we do need to investigate.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
We have another question from Steve Myers, and it's about slide 29 that shows the savings coming from non-residential groups. And the question specifically is, what sectors are contributing most to these savings? And will these be a focus of the upcoming study? And Steve, please jump in if further clarification is needed.
This is Laken, and so non-residential would include, if we think about the different focus sectors, would include commercial buildings, government public buildings, industrial sites and facilities, and then agriculture, and then always within the non-residential sphere, we have some other non-building loads that can be difficult to characterize. Sometimes can be difficult to characterize, whether it's wastewater treatment or water pumping, street lighting. There's a host of others, and it really varies on the geography. So primarily, though, I think those savings are going to be commercial and industrial, with some government buildings included, as well as some agriculture. And yes, those are all will be included in the current potential study. I think if my mind remembers correctly, the distribution of energy use in Wisconsin is if we think about the classic three sectors, res, com, industrials, relatively evenly distributed across the three, if I remember correctly. Somebody else can tell me I'm wrong. So at the savings, I think generally, at least recent historical savings have generally followed a similar distribution of savings relative to load by those high level sectors. But yeah, in short, we will include all those sectors in the current potential study.
There are no more questions in the chat. Is there anything anyone would just want to ask by unmuting themselves? Sounds like we have no additional questions.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. And thanks to everyone who has participated and who has asked questions today. I feel like we had some really great discussions. I know that our team has taken notes, and so as Jeremy mentioned and as Mitch mentioned earlier, we will have a website devoted to the potential study. It's currently being set up, and we'll email everyone with that information, and post. I think we can post meeting notes there as well, at least high level, and probably some specific questions for follow up. In terms of next steps, the next stakeholder meeting isn't yet scheduled, but we're eyeing June or July to talk about data collection, including options for data collection, and then acknowledging sort of the state of the world as it currently is with respect to COVID-19. We see a future where a potential follow-up data collection meeting may be needed in late summer. And so in the meantime, our team is working on coming up with scenarios and options and decision dates, so that we can make appropriate decisions as time warrants. Mitch, I'll pause there and see if you've got anything else to add.
No, nothing really. I really do appreciate all the discussion and questions. It's been a great meeting, and as I think like it was saying, if you've got follow-up questions, there's my email, Lakin's email on this slide. Anytime we accept any kind of comments and questions, and we're going to keep this going with another stakeholder meeting coming up in the next couple of months. So this is just the beginning.
And this is Steve Coper with Cadmus. I would also ask if there's any feedback around how the logistics and audio quality, anything that we could look at changing up in anticipation of having to do another one virtually. That would be helpful too, so that we make it as enjoyable and helpful as possible if we have to do it virtually again.
All right. Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Mitch. And with that, we'll conclude today's initial stakeholder meeting. Again, on behalf of Cadmus, and I just want to take the time to say thanks to everyone who participated. Thank you for your feedback. We look forward to hearing from you all in the future. Take care.